I think we are ready to get started. Good to see everybody in person, and I'm excited today that we have a speaker in person. I'm delighted to introduce the person who was supposed to introduce the speaker is not yet here, Mario, but in the interest of time, I think we should get started. I'm delighted to introduce today's seminar speaker, Dr. Hannah van Zanten is an associate professor at the Farming Systems Ecology Group at Wageningen University, and also a visiting professor here at Cornell University, Global Development. It is their ambition to unravel how circular food systems can contribute to producing healthy foods for a growing population with the carrying capacity of the earth. She graduated with an MS in animal sciences and a PhD in animal sciences, also at Wageningen University. And together with her team, she has developed a European circular food systems model, which is now being extended to being a global model. We look forward to hearing what she has to say today. The title of her talk is going to be Circular Food Systems Towards Human and Planetary Health. And with that, please help me welcome Dr. van Zanten.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here today and to have the opportunity to present my work to you about the work that we are doing on circular food systems. So we all know that food production has a big impact on the environment. And it's because of that that a lot of people are actually looking for potential solutions. And one of those solutions is that it would be best from an environmental point of view if we would all consume a vegan diet. What I would like to do during this presentation is to show you that a lot of those solutions are actually locked within the current linear food system that we have today. And that if we would redesign today's food system towards a more circular food system, we can actually see that animals can have an important role in future sustainable diets. So why is this difference there? So why do we actually see that some people are saying that it would be best from an environmental point of view, that it would be best if we consume a vegan diet, while others are actually saying that it would be better if we can still consume some animal source food? That has to do with the methodologies that we are using. So if we are using a life cycle assessment, then most studies that are actually using that methodology, they conclude that it would be best from an environmental point of view that we would consume a vegan diet. So who of you knows what a life cycle assessment is? Just to get a bit of a feeling here. Okay, thank you. So a life cycle assessment is a method to assess the environmental impact of a certain product or a certain chain. So in this case, it's about broiler production systems. So what we do in a life cycle assessment is we look at all the inputs that are needed to create a certain output. So for example, in the case of broiler production, we need feed, but to produce that feed, we also need fertilizers. So for each of those different inputs, we actually want to know what is the related environmental impact, which can be, in, for example, in terms of land use, but can also be, for example, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or biodiversity. So for each of those inputs, we relate to a certain environmental impact category, such as land use, and then we relate that to the output, in this case, broiler meat. So by doing that, we can actually give an indication of how much land, for example, is needed to produce 1 kilogram of meat. And we can do that for a lot of different food items. So here you see a study of Cora Nemecek published in Science in 2018, and they did a very big review of all the LCA studies that are done so far. And what you can see here is the amount of land which is needed to produce 100 grams of protein for a certain product. Then all the orange bars are the animal-based products, and the green bars are the plant-based products. So what you can see is that in general, the orange bars are higher compared to the green bars. We can also do this on a diet level. So what you can see here in this figure is the amount of animal source food in a certain diet. And here you can see the amount of land which is needed. Each little dot here represents one scenario relative to the vegan scenario. And what you can see is that if we reduce the amount of animal source food, we actually also reduce the amount of land use which is needed. We see a very similar trend here for global warming potential. So in general, most of the studies therefore conclude that from an environmental point of view, it's best if we would consume a vegan diet. We also see other studies that actually look at future foods. So in this study, we actually assessed what would happen if we would change or reduce the amount of animal source food and replace it by future foods. So future foods are, for example, insects or algae or cultured meat. And what we did in this study is we looked at the amount of land which is needed to fulfill our nutritional requirements. So each little figure here it's for protein, it's for calcium, and so on. So it's for different nutrients. So what you can see, the orange part are the future foods. Then the green part are the plant-based products. The blue bars are the fish, and the red parts are the livestock products. So if you look at this figure, you can see that in general, the orange bars are lower compared to the red bars. So this shows that if we would actually replace animal source food by future foods, we could potentially reduce land use, and we have similar figures for greenhouse gas emissions. You can also see that the green bars, so the plant-based products, are relatively lower compared to the red bars. But if you also zoom in here for vitamin B12, you can, for example, see that vitamin B12 is actually very hard to get from plant-based products. So therefore, future foods could also offer a solution to actually reduce the environmental impact while still producing the nutrients that we need on a daily basis. So those studies, those results that I just showed you, are all studies that used a life cycle assessment. And a life cycle assessment can really help us to get an overview of the current status quo of the environmental impact. So it shows us the current situation of how we are producing food. And based on those results, we can actually see that animal products are a hotspot. They do have a high environmental impact. But there's one big but, and that is that life cycle assessments, they ignore the potential of animals to recycle products that we cannot or do not want to consume ourselves. And I just want to reflect a bit more on this, just to give one example to make this point very clear. So here you can see two different production systems. One system here in the Netherlands, which is a dairy system, and those animals are fed with grain-based products. Then here we see a grazing system in Africa. So if you would compare those two systems, which one do you think is more environmental friendly? And I don't need to have an answer because we unfortunately don't have the time for a large discussion, but I would like you to just reflect on this yourself. So the answer depends again on the method you are choosing. So if you would look at the amount of feed, fresh matter feed, which is needed to produce a certain amount of milk, just in fresh matter, then you will see that the Dutch system is much more efficient. But if you change it and you are not looking at the fresh matter, but you in fact are looking at the human digestible protein in the feed that is needed to produce human digestible protein from the milk, then you actually see exactly the opposite result. Because in the Dutch system, we are actually feeding the animals with products that we can consume ourselves. Well, in this system, the cows are grazing on lands which cannot be used for anything else. So this example clearly shows you that depending on the method you are choosing, you can get different results. And that relates very much to this topic of feed-food competition. And this is very important because what we see today is that 30% of the grains are used to feed our animals. And that 40% of all the arable land is now used to produce feed for animals. Well, we could also use that land to actually directly feed humans. And this is always much more efficient if we would use the land to feed humans directly than compared to feeding the animals first. So what if we would redesign today's food system to a food system where we avoid feed-food competition, to a food system where we respect the planetary boundaries, where we make sure that every person on this planet has access to enough healthy food, by actually applying circularity principles, such as avoiding waste and using animals as recyclers. So to assess this, over the last years, we developed the CFOS model, the Circular Food Systems Model. And what this model does, it actually aims to fulfill our nutritional requirements in terms of different nutrients, so vitamin B12, calcium, and so on. But not only in terms of nutrients. We also aim to actually look at the different food groups and to make sure that people consume enough fiber, that we don't consume too much red meat, or that we don't consume too much sugar, so that we end up really with a healthy diet at the end. We also aim to stay within the planetary boundaries, to reduce land use, greenhouse gas emissions, and water and biodiversity. And we do that by actually looking at different zones in the world. So we have the model now more or less ready for Europe, but we aim to extend it to a global level. And we have divided Europe in different zones. And in each zone, we can actually grow different crops. So the model selects the crops which are needed to fulfill our human nutritional requirements. But during that process, we also produce leftover streams, such as crop residues, for example, but also co-products, such as, for example, wheat middlings. And we also have a certain amount of food waste. Of course, it's better to reduce food waste, but if we produce food waste, it would be best to use it in the most efficient way. And we can make use of human excreta. So all those different leftover streams can be used as a fertilizer, but they can also be partly used as feed for animals. And if we would use them as feed for animals, we create again animal source food, which can be used to fulfill our daily nutritional requirements. Then we also create some leftover streams, such as, for example, slaughter waste, or for example, manure, which can be used again, which can be recycled as well. And we make use of the global fisheries, so in a sustainable way, and then the nutrients can be used again as food, but the waste streams can also be used again as a feed for the animals, for example. So with this model, we aim to answer questions such as, what should we actually eat to make sure that we are consuming a healthy diet while respecting the planetary boundaries? We aim to say something about where should we grow which crops, and which animals should we keep, and how many animals, and in which kind of production system should we keep them. So over the last years, we did a lot of research on this topic, and we are still extending it and making it bigger each time. But what our results so far show is that if we are feeding animals only with the leftovers from our food system, so products that we cannot or do not want to consume ourselves, we can produce about 20 grams of protein per person per day. And this is about 2/3 of the global current consumption of animal source food. So if we would do this, if we would, instead of not doing this, we actually would consume a vegan diet, we need to replace this part by plant-based products that actually do require, again, arable land. And that brings me to the next figure. So what you can see here in this figure is the amount of grams of proteins from animal source food in a certain diet, and the related amount of arable land which is needed. And then you can see here some results for a vegan diet. Here you can see a dot for our current consumption pattern. And then you can see 3 global studies that assess the potential amount of animal source food that we can consume if we would only feed the animals with the leftover streams of our system. And what you can see here in this figure is that if we would consume this circular diet, we actually reduce our arable land use more compared to a vegan diet and much more compared to our current diet. We have similar results for greenhouse gas emissions from a different study. So what we did in this study is we took the EAT-Lancet as a starting point, and we assessed whether or not it is actually possible to apply the circularity principles to this EAT-Lancet reference diet. So what you see here is, again, the amount of animal source food in a complete diet, and in terms of grams of protein per person per day. And here you can see the greenhouse gas emissions related to this diet. Then here you can see the study, the EAT-Lancet reference diet. And you can see this line of 500 kilos of CO2 equivalents per person per year, which is the boundary given in the EAT-Lancet publication. Then you can see 3 different scenarios that we assessed. This blue one, the complete healthy one, is like the same as the EAT-Lancet reference diet. And what you can see here is that in this scenario, we would actually consume slightly less animal products, but we are actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions a lot. If we would go to the second scenario, it's slightly less healthy, because in that scenario, we are actually consuming refined grains instead of whole grains. But if you consume refined grains, you produce much more co-products, and therefore the role of animals can increase. And that's what you see in this figure. We can produce more animal source food compared to this one. And you also see that the greenhouse gas emissions are going slightly up. Then we have the last scenario here. And here we completely ignore the recommendations from the EAT-Lancet in terms of the animal source foods. But we assessed, like, if we would consume the plant-based part, which is recommended in the EAT-Lancet, and assess the amount of leftover streams that we can get from this, and try to produce as much animal source food as possible, then we can actually produce almost 40 grams of protein per person per day. But those proteins are not the ones that are actually recommended. So what we see in that scenario is that it's actually a lot of red meat. So what you see here is that we actually, if we would go completely for a circular diet, you don't necessarily produce those food items that are recommended in the different guidelines. What we also looked at is not only the different food items, but also the different nutrients. Can we fulfill our nutritional requirements in all those different nutrients that you can see here? And the conclusion is yes, for most of them, we can actually easily reach them. So in terms of the nutrients, we can see it's rather easy to fulfill them, but in terms of the right food items, we see that it's more difficult. And that's also something we saw in another publication. which will be published hopefully soon, in which we looked at the different food-based dietary guidelines in different countries in Europe. And here we actually try to also apply the different circularity principles and see whether or not it is feasible to then still consume the recommended amounts of the different animal products in those different food-based dietary guidelines. And what you can see here are the different products. So here it's milk, beef, pork, chicken, eggs, and fish. And you can see the different scenarios for the different countries. If it's on this side, then it actually means we are not reaching those requirements. If it's on this side, we do. So what you see is for milk and beef, again, it's feasible. Then we go to pork, you see it becomes more difficult. We go to chicken, it's not feasible, and the same for eggs and fish. So what does this tell us? Do we actually need to adjust those guidelines? I think this is a question we would like to answer in the future. I think it's very important if we look at those different food-based dietary guidelines, not to only look at from a health perspective, but to see how we can find the synergies to actually reach health and reduce the environmental impact at the same time. So then you might wonder, okay, this is a very long theoretical story. Are things actually happening in reality as well? And therefore, I would like to show you this little video. This is a farm I'm working with a lot together. And it's a farm, a laying hen farm in the Netherlands, which are only feeding leftover streams to their laying hens. And they started in the Netherlands, but they are actually now also here in the US. So this is a concept which is really increasing lately. Let me see. No, that's not working. It did work. We tested it. Een circulair voedselsysteem is een systeem. Okay, I think I just keep it small then, okay? Because if I... Een circulair voedselsysteem is een systeem waar we in de toekomst naartoe willen, om ervoor te zorgen dat we voldoende voedsel kunnen blijven produceren binnen de grenzen van onze planeet. Waarbij we dus... Een circulair voedselsysteem is een systeem waar we in de toekomst naartoe willen, om ervoor te zorgen dat we voldoende voedsel kunnen blijven produceren binnen de grenzen van onze planeet. Waarbij we dus bijvoorbeeld zo min mogelijk land willen gebruiken of zo min mogelijk water. Zodat we de aarde niet uitputten, terwijl iedereen wel beschikking heeft tot voldoende voedsel. Ik ben Hannah van Zanten en ik onderzoek de rol van het dier in een circulair voedselsysteem. De rol van dieren in een circulair voedselsysteem is dat ze eigenlijk reststromen kunnen eten. Dit bedrijf hier verzamelen ze die reststromen en daar gaan ze uiteindelijk weer veevoer van maken. Ja, dat zijn producten die anders weggegooid zouden worden. Het zijn producten die we niet kunnen of willen eten. Wat we op dit moment ook zien is dat dieren met producten worden gevoerd, zoals granen, die wij ook kunnen eten. En daardoor ontstaat er eigenlijk een beetje een competitie om die granen, of we die nou aan dieren gaan geven of aan de mens. Al die producten komen binnen in de fabriek en een heel proces komt eraan te pas en uiteindelijk hebben we een brokje. Bij kipsen hebben we gekeken met hun overlegd van nou, wat voor een voer zouden die kippen nou eigenlijk moeten hebben om toch ervoor te zorgen dat ze die eieren nog kunnen leggen, maar wel een voer wat dus alleen maar bestaat uit restproducten. Want ieder dier heeft natuurlijk zijn eigen unieke eigenschappen. En wat ik wil weten is welk dier we nou het beste kunnen gebruiken om welk restproduct uiteindelijk om te zetten naar bijvoorbeeld melk of vlees of eieren. Die hoeveelheid aan reststromen die we hebben is natuurlijk beperkt, beschikbaar. Dat betekent ook dat er een grens zit aan de hoeveelheid dierlijke producten die we kunnen produceren. En op dit moment zien we, als we dus naar zo'n circulair voedselsysteem toe zouden willen, dat we in Europa de hoeveelheid dierlijk product wat we nu eten tenminste moeten halveren. Ik vind het heel leuk om dat te zien, dat het in de praktijk daadwerkelijk een bedrijf is wat dit oppakt en wat gewoon alleen maar reststromen aan zijn dieren voert. Omdat dat aangeeft dat we dus langzaam echt naar zo'n circulair voedselsysteem toe moeten. Het is niet alleen een theoretisch iets wat nu ontwikkeld is, maar het is ook iets wat nu door de praktijk wordt opgepakt. Okay, so I hope this also gave you an overview of that we can in fact really implement such circularity principles in practice. So my take-home message of today is that despite that we see different methods and therefore different conclusions, at the end, all the different studies come to the conclusion that in high-income countries, it's very important to reduce the consumption of animal source foods. We also see that future foods can play an important role in future food systems if by actually replacing the animal-based products in our diets. We also found that redesigning the food system offers us to actually come to a sustainable food system where we respect the planetary boundaries and make sure that we are consuming a healthy diet. And the last point, which is very important, is that we need to use this food systems approach to actually make sure that we find the synergies and we avoid the trade-offs if we are looking at how can we redesign today's food system towards a more sustainable food system. Thank you very much for your attention. Are there questions?
Thank you, Professor van Zanten. We have lots of time for Q&A. So if you can raise your hand. For those who are joining us online, please either post your question in comments or just raise your hand. We'll try to get to everybody. So anybody with questions, I'll get the mic over to you. All right, there's one there. And if you can just say your name and make your question as brief.
Sure, thank you. Is this working?
Get closer to yourself.
Hello? Oh, yeah. There we go. Hi, my name is Eric. And I had a question, wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the challenges of implementation of the circular food system. So one question I'm wondering is, it looked like that facility that you had for the poultry was more of an advanced production facility of the feed. I'm wondering if at smaller scales, there is a disparity in the quality of the feed, in which case it would be difficult to compete with folks who are using commercial feed. And then the second question I have is animal health, I imagine, would be a significant concern in certain cases, specifically in pigs, like African swine fever is transmitted by feeding human food waste, et cetera. So I was wondering if you could talk about those challenges.
Yeah, thank you. So the first question, if this is actually feasible to implement, I think the company is actually still doing a lot of tailor-made work. It's not so automatic as most of the feed industries are. They are collecting from whole Europe. They are collecting streams, and they also have to be very careful that they select the right ones to because of the food safety issues. So, but they managed to find a way to actually find streams that are safe to use, and then they developed the whole production system. And that's, of course, it's a technology which they develop, but I hope other companies in the future can also develop it to at the end translate it into a pellet which can be used, or into a syrup. That's also something they are producing. So yes, on the one hand, you need the industry to translate it into pellets. But on the other hand, there are, of course, if you go much more to smallholder systems, there are also other ways, as long as you are very careful with selecting the products that you want to use. And that, of course, brings me to your second question related to food safety. I think there are a lot of ways to actually heat treat a lot of the food waste. We can also find ways to separate the animal product from the plant-based products, and their technology really comes in. And of course, technology to a certain extent is still limiting. So I do see in Asian countries that it is actually already much more advanced, that they collect much more of the plant-based food waste and are using it, heat treating it, and then transforming it into pellets. So there is much more the technology already in place. But I think we can do much more with technology. So I would be very eager to actually make sure that this becomes much more on the political agendas and that people are finding the right technologies to do this. But at the end, it should work. I mean, if you can see what we can do with technologies, why shouldn't this work then at the end? So, yeah.
Next question over
Yeah.
here.
Hi, my name is Windu. I'm from Indonesia. So in my country, there are some small-scale circular food system that already been there since maybe since ancient age. So some of the farmers, they using like the animal manure to and you process it and use it as the fertilizer, and also like using some safe household waste also as fertilizer. And how do you think for us to convince the government to take the next step in encouraging the people, especially the farmers and the industry, to adopt this kind of circular food system, which it's not only that it will be good for the environment, but it can be good for the farmers and the industry itself. So have you ever have like an experience how to talk about it with the government? And like if you ever do that, is there any policy that have been enacted by the government, maybe in your country or in Europe? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So I do think so. Like if I look at the company, the laying hen farm, what they actually did is they developed the concept, and then they started first to go to a supermarket, and there they made a very clear agreement on the price. So this was the way how they actually, kind of approached this. And then they made this agreement on the price, but they also said, okay, we want to have for at least 5 years, we want to have this stable price. So that actually allows us to develop what we are doing, because they are really, it is a kind of a life experiment that they are conducting. And they also said, like, we don't want to first wait till science is ready for this. They want to just do this and see what is happening. And we do see there that they do face a lot of issues, that sometimes there's too much salt, for example, in the feed, and that has an impact on the health of the animals. So they are trying to find a way while actually already selling their product. And they made this agreement with the supermarket, Lidl in this case, to have this stable price that allows them to come to a concept that is really working. And I think there they did something very strong, which not a lot of other companies are doing. And by creating this way of actually having the security for themselves to develop their concept further. So this is, I think, one thing, like, creativity also from farmers to find a way to do this and to still get a reasonable or a good income. So I think that's one part. The other part related to the policies, we do see in the Netherlands that we have now a circular, like a policy which is much more in place to stimulate circularity. But it is still very hard to actually define, like, how are we making that transition? Because if you think about, so if you see, for example, the results that I just showed you, that chickens are not so much in a circular food system. Well, if we look at today, then most policies are actually stimulating us to reduce the amount of beef and eat chicken instead. So, and yes, on the short term, if you think about this LCA study and on the short term, when we are still consuming quite a lot of animal source food, this makes sense. But on the long term, it doesn't. So what should a policymaker do? Should they actually talk about what is needed in the future, or should they stimulate small steps at this moment? And that's a very tough question that I know a lot of policymakers, also on the European level, they are struggling with this. How do you communicate your message, and on what term, what time frame are you actually stimulating this? So there are things going on, but I think what is mainly going on is that there is a debate and that there is a discussion and that people are actually looking for ways how we can stimulate this transition. But it's not such a clear roadmap yet, to be honest.
Okay, we're gonna go to Jennifer Reitman online. If you can unmute yourself and ask the question, then I'll come to Professor Herrera after.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if you could speak about the nutrient benefit and the greenhouse gas impact of producing insect proteins from this food waste as compared to traditional livestock consumption of this food waste.
So your question is if the benefits of insects, but insects fed with food waste compared to the benefits of feeding the livestock with food waste? Was that the question?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so in principle, it depends on where you're using the insects for. So if you use the insects for human consumption, then it makes sense also from a nutrition point of view and an environmental point of view to use some of the food waste to feed to the insects and some of the food waste to feed to livestock, to make sure that you at the end get this balance in nutrients that we need on a daily basis. But if you're using the insects as a feed for livestock, then in terms of the environmental impact, it doesn't make so much sense. Of course, you can better directly then feed the food waste to livestock instead of first feeding it to the insects. But as long as that is not allowed, what we see, of course, in Europe, then it is an intermediate step. So it can actually help us now if we are feeding food waste to insects and then the insects to livestock, it can help us to reduce the environmental impact at this moment. But on the long term, it's better not to do that. I hope that answers your question.
Next question.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mario Herrera, and I'm one of the ones that really benefits from working with Hannah. I learn a lot about these topics. There's still some things that I'm really interested in your views. I mean, food waste can have multiple destinies.
Yeah.
One of them being to put it as animal feed. You could put it as compost. You can do energy. You can do a range of things.
Yeah.
Under which circumstances does it really make sense to use this food waste as animal feed versus the other potential fates? And also, do you think that this competition for food waste will intensify in the future as we develop other ways of using it or even reduce it?
Yeah. Yeah, so I cannot answer the question yet for if we should use the food waste as a fertilizer or as a feed for animals. We are now, because most of the results that I showed you today are in this part, where we actually keep this part still fixed. But we hope to have that somewhere this summer. So we are finalizing those results. And then we actually have this whole picture here in place. And then the model actually, based on how we set up the model, we can make a choice whether or not all those leftover streams should be used here as a fertilizer and for which of the crops and or for grassland or what so, like, or if we can actually use it as feed for animals. So that will come. But indeed, it needs, that's the big question. And even what we see, also what we showed in the Nature Food publication related to EAT-Lancet is that, yes, the amount of leftover streams or the amount of food waste really depend also on what we consume. And if we are more willing to consume like whole grains, for example, then also this role of animals is immediately reducing. Or if we found new technologies to actually avoid those amount of leftovers that we have here, then the role again reduces. So there's a direct relation.
The next question comes from somebody online, Javid Mia. I hope I'm pronouncing your name well. If you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for entertaining my question. My question is, I work mostly in Asia, and waste collection systems, including food waste system collection systems, are pretty much non-existent. So the question is, any views on how to address this barrier to adoption of circular food systems? Because if you don't have a system where food waste is collected, aggregated, and then can come into a circular food system concept, that missing link, any views on how to address that barrier? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So it indeed, at the end, most of the results that I showed today are very much from this linear system originating from high income countries. And what we aim now to do in this new project is also to see, okay, how can we apply circularity principles in, for example, low income countries, what is already in place. And because at the end, the solutions need to be tailor-made. It's not like there is one solution that fits everywhere. I mean, that would be great, but that's not the case. So what we aim to do is to actually get a better understanding by making such a big model, like on what is the trends, what do we see, but at the same time go to different case countries and look at what does make sense there and how can we actually apply those circularity principles and come to a transition of the system. So if they are not in place, the big question is, of course, is there so much food waste or is there no food waste? And or if there is food waste, where is it actually used for? What is the current application? And by answering and getting an understanding of your current food system, then you can also assess like, okay, what can we actually do to reduce the impact? So this is how I would go about or try to figure it out.
I have a question that actually builds off on that. I would imagine that this kind of models work, I can imagine them working at a small farm level. It gets more complicated from farm to village to a town to a country. You're doing it at the European level and at the global level. Can you speak a little bit to the differences on the dynamics as you're trying to expand this, given the already inertia of specialization of production that's already there in the world?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So what it is, we actually don't have the farm in here. We have different zones. And in those different zones, we can have different crops. So it is, you can imagine, yes, it is a very big model because we need to know on a global scale which zones, and they are depending on climate and soil types, are there. And if we know that, which crops can we grow there and what will be their yield? But it's not a spatial model in that sense that we really know, like, okay, here there's this farm and there's this farm, and this is how they how they need to change. That we first make this whole model on a global scale in place, and we want to do that to make actually sure that we understand the different trade flows. Because if you would make such a model on a small scale, you don't know what is actually happening. You cannot be self-sufficient. I mean, there's trade going on. That's not something we can simply stop. So that's very important to actually have that first in place. So it is on a much higher aggregation level, the global model. And from there, we go to the different case countries and we look at, okay, which farms are there? How is this, what we are kind of theoretically proposing, affecting a certain region and therefore a farmer? So this is how we address that. So we play around with the different skills, and by first having it on a high aggregation level, and then we can actually zoom in. But by doing that, we are able to actually assess the issue of scale.
We have 1 minute.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Appreciate it. I was wondering, as far as waste recycling, is human waste involved in your model, or is that something separate?
Yeah, so yeah, we have the human excreta in the model too. It's something Wolfram is working on. And we might do also a seminar there. So if you're interested in that, you're very welcome. But what we are doing is that we actually have it in here, and it can be used as a fertilizer. And therefore, we have different scenarios of to what extent we can actually use this. And then it's replacing, in fact, artificial fertilizer. So this is the way how we're assessing that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I think we've come to the end of our time, but I think Professor Van Zanten will be on campus for the next 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And available. Maybe Professor Herrera has something to say on that. But,
Yes.
Let's thank you for her time, first of all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, just to let everybody know that Hannah is visiting us. Well, apart from her being a visiting professor here with global development, she will be here until the 8th of April. So she would be available if anybody's interested in picking her brain or something like that. She will be around. And also, for PhD students that Hannah supervises will also be here. What we're trying to do is to establish start a joint program on circularity between Cornell and Wageningen. So really watch this space, because there's going to be all sorts of opportunities for going to Wageningen and students from Wageningen coming here and so on. So we're really excited about this possibility. And yes, as Ed said, you know, you're one of the experts in this field, and it's a pleasure for you to have shared your thoughts. So, cheers.
Thank you.